Bill C-34, otherwise known as the National Security Review of Investments Modernization Act, seeks to update and strengthen the Investment Canada Act in an aim to protect Canada's national security when it comes to foreign investments in our country. As the tensions rise around the world, Canadians, our businesses, and our intellectual property, our private data, and our natural resources must be protected from bad actors who seek to undermine our sovereignty and exert influence on our institutions and way of life in Canada. For 8 years, this NDP Liberal government has not taken sensitive transactions seriously and has failed to conduct full reviews of transactions involving Chinese state-owned enterprises, which seriously jeopardizes the security of Canadians and our government. According to Statistics Canada, China's share of Canadian assets under foreign control doubled from 1.9% to 3.8% between 2015 and 2019. Large shares of key industries are also under foreign control. 40% of all assets in Canada's oil and gas industry. Wholesale trade is 48%. Manufacturing is 44%. Mining and quarrying is 30%. Professional scientific and technical services is 25%. With so much of Canada's economy controlled by foreign companies and governments, it is crucial that we ensure foreign investments do not pose a threat to our national security and prevent bad actors from weaponizing Canada's economy and our own resources against us. Let's take a look at some recent examples of investments this government missed. Number one, the Neo-Lithium Corp and Zijin Mining. In March 2021, the Minister of Industry updated and enhanced guidelines for transactions involving critical minerals and state-owned enterprises. Yet just 10 months later, he ignored those new guidelines, allowing Canadian mining company Neo-Lithium Corp to be acquired by Zijin Mining, a Chinese state-owned enterprise, without a security review. For real? Number two, Sinclair Technologies and Hytera Communications. In December 2022, the RCMP awarded a contract to supply sensitive hardware for their communication systems to Sinclair Technologies, which is directly linked to Hytera Communications, a company partially owned by the Chinese government and a major supplier of China's public security ministry. It was revealed in December of 2022 that the CBSA used Hytera's technology and communications equipment in 2017. Hytera has been charged with 21 counts of espionage in the U.S. and has been banned from doing business in that country. In 2017, when Hytera acquired BC-based telecommunications company Norsat International, the parent company of Sinclair Technologies, the Minister of Industry failed to request a full national security review. Conservatives have long called on this government to take swift action to ensure that any time a foreign state-owned enterprise seeks to invest in a Canadian corporation or asset, the government conducts a thorough review. At second reading of this bill, Conservatives voted to advance this proposed legislation to the Industry Committee, upon which I sit, with a clear expectation that significant amendments would be made. At Industry Committee, Conservatives tabled a number of amendments to ensure these reviews take place and to strengthen this legislation as a whole. Some of the amendments tabled by my colleagues and I at Industry were adopted. However, many more were voted down by this government. Number one, we wanted to modify the definition of state-owned enterprises to include any company or entity headquartered in an authoritarian state. They rejected that. Number two, we wanted to list specific sectors necessary to preserve Canada's national security rather than the systematic approach applied or recommended by public servants. They rejected that. Number three, we wanted to exempt non-Canadian Five Eye intelligence state-owned enterprises from the national security review process to prevent an overly broad review process for an ally like United States or Australia. They rejected that. Number four, we wanted to allow the Government of Canada to maintain ownership of intangible assets that have been developed in whole or in part by taxpayer-funded dollars. They rejected that. Number five, we wanted to allow the minister to go back and review past state-owned acquisitions through the national security review process to allow for a flexible review process. They rejected that ministerial power. We know that public servants do take a risk risk-adverse approach in crafting regulations and providing advice during the legislative process. That's not necessarily a bad thing, that's a good thing. However, politicians must be willing to make the tough decisions, weighing the potential benefits against the repercussions of any decision. Going back to that first rejected amendment, Conservatives moved to include companies headquartered in authoritarian state in the definition of state-owned enterprises to ensure that they are automatically subject to security reviews. We just want to protect our sovereignty. Public servants warned against calling out certain nations like this as it could conflict with WTO obligations. However, when we look at the 2019 annual report from the NSICOP Committee, the National Security Committee of Parliament, it highlighted activities carried out by the People's Republic of China and Canada, stating that they were a clear threat to security of Canada. The report also stated that foreign interference represents a significant threat to Canadian society and our fundamental institutions. In the government's own Indo-Pacific strategy, and I'm going to quote it, it states, China has benefited from the rules-based international order to grow and prosper, but it is now actively seeking to reinterpret these rules to gain greater advantage. China's assertive pursuit of its economic and security interests, advancements of unilateral claims, foreign interference, and increasingly coercive treatment of other countries and economies have significant implications in the region, in Canada, and around the world. Despite all this, the Liberals and the Bloc members voted down our amendment. Frankly, it's not surprising, given how long this government has ignored the 2019 NSICOP report, which called for a foreign agent registry, and the fact that our Prime Minister has said he admires the basic dictatorship of China. So the question before me today that I want the government members to answer, do they really believe that with the amendments that we put forward in good faith, that they rejected, that this bill is as strong as it could be to protect Canadian assets, companies, and our sovereignty, most importantly? I don't believe that they can answer with a yes, Mr. Speaker. Thankfully, a few of our common sense conservative amendments were passed. Number one, we were reducing the threshold to trigger a national security review from $512 million to $0 for any investment by a state-owned enterprise. I think if there's one thing we walk away from the work that this Conservative Party did, is that we are standing up for Canadian sovereignty by changing this fundamental aspect of the Investment Canada Act. Moving forward, when this is passed, when China looks at it of looking strategically to take an asset in Canada, say mining rights or a small mine, that would fall under the threshold, which I believe this year is at $512 million, that strategic move that they're trying to make into the Canadian economy will now be subject to a security review. That is thanks to the hard work of the Conservative members. Number two, we're ensuring that items reviewable under the National Security Review process include acquisitions of any assets by state-owned enterprises. Number three, we have worked to ensure that an automatic national security review is conducted whenever a company has previously been convicted of corruption charges. And number four, requiring the minister to conduct a national security review by changing may to shall to ensure a review is triggered whenever in the review threshold. And that brings us to today. Conservatives have brought forward a common sense amendment here at report stage that will protect the Minister of Checks and Balances, will protect the system of checks and balances in place in respect to the Minister's power to undertake or not undertake a national security review. Our amendment would remove Clause 15 of Bill C-34, reverting to the language back in the existing text of the Investment Canada Act. This would ensure that Cabinet plays an active role to ensure regional representation in major decisions made about foreign investment in our country. In conclusion, I understand what the Liberals are trying to do here by streamlining decisions through the Minister of Industry and Public Safety, but we must ensure that regional representation plays a role in national security review moving forward. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I do appreciate the amendment bringing the threshold to $0 with respect to state-owned enterprises. I would like to ask my honourable colleague his opinion about the investment done by multinational companies where they come and capture the entire sector. But like today, the steel and aluminum sector are entirely foreign-owned. They just become the branch office of the foreign multinationals, focusing only on the North American markets, never attempt to export the talent, the resources, the expertise that is available in Canada to the countries where we have free trade agreement across the world. Does that not also fit into the definition of economic security, which in my view is same as national security?
I missed the first part of that question, but I will note that the member from Nepean actually stood alongside conservative members in the House during second reading when he called for some of the changes to the National Security Review. But more broadly to his point, I think when we look at the Investment Canada Act, the Government of Canada needs to be looking very closely right now at protecting strategic interests. And that's what we were trying to do. And that's not just from foreign state-owned actors. That does include multinational companies as well. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Our colleague, it says the Bloc voted against the Conservative amendments, but I want to specify that the Conservative amendments, they wanted to have all Crown corporations that aren't part of the Five Eyes be considered hostile. I don't know if they know that in Quebec, 40% of investments from Europe are in Quebec. There's Airbus that builds planes in Mirabel in partnership with Quebec's government. So it would have been quite something if the Conservative amendments had gone through. In this House today, the question is, will the Bloc protect the sovereignty of Quebec and support the Conservative amendment that will keep regional representation in Cabinet and not only in the hands of just one minister? Imagine a minister from British Columbia who can make a decision for the Quebec nation. And the member of Cabinet from Quebec cannot have anything to say about that decision. The Bloc Québécois will vote with the Conservatives for this amendment to protect sovereignty, not only for Quebec, but for all of Canada.
Earlier, the NDP were talking about the fact that we have no protections in Canada for extra large corporations that are making billions of profits that are basically sucking up all the little guys in this country. So I wonder if the member would speak about whether they agree that we should have rules like the United States do, where we can break up these extra large oligarchies, basically, that are taking over competition in Canada.
I appreciate the question regarding the Competition Act, which has been debated very recently in the House of Commons. But the Investment Canada Act is a bit different than the Competition Act. What we're focused on here today is ensuring that, irrespective of political party, that the Government of Canada has the necessary tools and framework to protect Canadian sovereignty, to ensure that our elected officials can make appropriate decisions when foreign investment wants to come into this country, and make a decision to ensure that it is a net benefit gain for Canada when foreign investment dollars come to our wonderful country. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Just a quick question as to why it's so important that we brought down the threshold from $512 million to zero.
The honourable member in 30 seconds.
Mr. Speaker, it was so important to reduce the threshold to zero to account for intangible assets, for small mines in the natural resource sector, or for businesses that could fall below the threshold but would ensure a strategic asset for another a state-owned enterprise or a foreign government that doesn't necessarily have the best interest of Canada at heart. What we're doing with this amendment is following along the lines of our other like-minded nations to protect strategic assets in Canada or corporations. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.